When I first saw the concrete, brick, and rusted iron structure that was St. Margaret's prison, my heart sank below my stomach. I expected harsh conditions, cold steel bars, nagging voices, and stern looks. But the building itself, this prison seemed very bleak. It was hard for me to explain, but goosebumps ran through my whole body as I looked at St. Margaret's. My name is Michael, and I am a new recruit, a novice guard who has joined the staff of this prison. My introduction to Warden David was as chilling as the prison walls. He was lean, his weather-beaten face riddled with wrinkles that spoke of years of tireless vigilance. His eyes were a cold, piercing blue. I felt at once like a child in front of him. He briefly explained my duties and offered me a handshake that felt more like a vice. The rest of the guards were an eclectic group, men hardened by the freezing cold of the prison and the dangerous creatures they kept in their cages. They reeked of a strange solemnity, and there was a look of wariness in their gaze. The prisoners were a different story. They were quiet, too quiet. During my brief stay at the other facility, the prisoners were noisy, but here they moved like ghosts, their voices barely above a whisper. My first week passed in a series of long, grueling shifts and sleepless nights. The prison was tense, very quiet to the point of inexplicable terror. Before I got here, I couldn't even have imagined that such a prison existed. It seemed strange to me that even the most hardened criminals looked frightened, their eyes darting around nervously, their bodies bouncing at the slightest sound. Warden David was an enigma, his behavior bordering on peculiar. His office was a shrine to orderliness, everything in its place, yet there was a certain unease that clung to the air. There were times I'd catch him staring blankly at the old stone walls. Sometimes, late at night, I'd see him walking the corridors, the dim light casting eerie shadows on his face. Each time I'd offer a greeting, he'd respond with a curt nod and move on, the echo of his footfalls lingering long after he'd disappeared into the darkness. I tried to make sense of it all, but the more I observed, the less I understood. The other guards were no different, their strange habits and cryptic conversations adding to the mystery. Their laughter was hollow, their camaraderie forced. As the days turned into weeks, the prison seemed to grow darker, the air denser. Each creak of the ancient structure, each whine of the wind through barred windows, it all seemed to resonate with an uncanny malevolence. I felt it in my bones, a gnawing dread that something wasn't quite right. The prison wasn't just a building. I tried to confide in my fellow guards about the strange atmosphere, but they only met me with stony silence and sidelong glances. Their response, or lack thereof, made me feel even more isolated, heightening my unease. Even amidst this unsettling environment, I tried to keep my focus on the task at hand, to maintain order and ensure the safety of the prisoners. But their fear was contagious. The sight of these hardened criminals, men who had committed unspeakable acts, trembling in their cells, was unnerving to say the least. One day, on my rounds, I came face to face with Big Jim, the prison's most notorious inmate. His record would have made even the most hardened criminal pale. But as I stood before him, I saw something I never expected to see. Fear. He stared at me for a moment, his eyes widened and full of despair, and then in a hoarse whisper he said, "It's watching." His words sent a chill down my spine. It was as if his words confirmed the anxious feelings that had been building up in me since my arrival. When I arrived at St. Margaret's, I expected the usual difficulties of guarding dangerous criminals. But there was something inexplicable here. I had to figure out what was going on here. And the more I began to delve into the mysteries of the prison, the more I realized that the real danger was not behind bars. It was in the shadows, lurking in the corners, watching and waiting. The weeks turned into months in prison, and my initial discomfort turned into a constant sense of dread. A series of unexplained deaths swept through the prison like a silent storm, each one more horrific than the last. Men were found dead in their cells. their faces distorted with expressions of utter terror, their bodies covered with deep, savage wounds that no human hand could inflict. Every morning seemed to begin with the discovery of another lifeless body. The prison doctor, a haggard old man with rheumatic eyes, repeated the same thing. No sign of a struggle. The fear among the prisoners became palpable. Trying to make sense of the unexplained deaths, I began questioning the prisoners, but their answers were invariably the same. They whispered stories of monstrous apparitions and dark shadows that haunted the prison corridors at night. Every time I listened to their stories, I felt a chill run down my spine. The more I questioned, however, the more I realized that my questioning was attracting attention. I often noticed that the other guards were watching me. Then came the night that changed everything. It was an unusually quiet night. I was on night duty and walking through deserted corridors, my heart pounding in oppressive silence. As I turned the corner, I froze. There, at the end of the dimly lit corridor, stood a figure. She was tall, much taller than any man I'd ever seen, about 3 meters tall. Her silhouette was vaguely masculine, but there was an unnatural bulkiness to it, a wolfish hump in the shoulders that sent a wave of fear through my veins. The figure was dressed in the familiar uniform of a prison guard, but there was nothing familiar about the creature it concealed. I could hear my heartbeat echoing in my ears as I stood still, my mind trying to comprehend the phenomenon before me. The creature tilted its head, a low growl escaping its throat that seemed to vibrate in the stones of the prison. I was a rabbit caught in the gaze of a wolf, my body frozen with terror. But survival instinct is a strong thing. It took over, and I spun on my heels and raced down the corridor, the creature's growl echoing behind me. I managed to get lost in the maze of corridors, my breath hitched in ragged breaths as I pressed against the shadowy canyon. I heard the creature's heavy footsteps grow fainter and fainter, its growling distant. I stayed there, in the darkness, long after the sound subsided, my heart pounding as if trying to escape my chest. When I finally emerged, the prison was once again shrouded in a cloak of silent terror. In that moment, I realized that the prison was a hunting ground, and that we, both guards and prisoners, were the prey. The other guards seemed to sense the change in me. Their cold glances became wary, their conversations hushed as I passed by. I could feel their gazes on me, watching, waiting. For what exactly I did not know. My nights became restless. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind boded for the return of the creature. The once familiar corridors of the prison became alien, the darkness hiding unseen threats. My days were filled with paranoia. Each pair of eyes that met mine carried a silent question. Was it too much I knew? In my desperate quest for answers, I decided to confront Warden David. He was an enigma, his hard face rarely betraying emotion. But I had to try. If there was anyone who might know the secrets of the prison, it was him. With a heavy heart, I stepped into the warden's office, a room as stark and imposing as the man himself. David was behind his desk, his eyes scanning over a stack of papers. He looked up as I entered, his gaze as cold and unyielding as the stone walls of the prison. I steeled myself, the words ready on my tongue. And then, I spilled the truth. I confessed my real identity, that I was a police officer sent to investigate the murders and disappearances in the prison. I told him about the creature I had seen, the monstrous apparition that haunted the corridors. David listened in silence, his face impassive. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, regarding me with an unreadable gaze. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest for his response. But instead of answers, his lips curled into a slow, chilling smile. "Is that so?" he said, his voice a low drawl. Then he stood and walked over to the door of his office, opening it wide. He called out, and within moments, the other guards were in the room. Their eyes were on me, their expressions a mirror of the warden's chilling smile. Before I could react, They were upon me, their grip like iron bands. I was dragged away, my protests falling on deaf ears. The world spun around me as I was thrown into a cell, the cold, hard floor of the prison meeting my back. The door was slammed shut, the echo of the metal against metal reverberating through the narrow space. I was now a prisoner in the very institution I was sent to investigate. I spent my days in confinement, my mind racing with questions. What was the creature that lurked in the shadows? Why was the warden protecting its existence? And most importantly, how was I going to survive? I was trapped in a nightmare, the prison's cold, unforgiving walls my only companion. At night, the silence of my cell was broken by the heavy footsteps echoing in the corridors, the guttural growl of the beast sending icy tendrils of fear coiling around my heart. The prisoners' screams pierced the night, their terror seeping into the stone walls of St. Margaret's Penitentiary. Each cry was a chilling reminder of the monstrous predator that lurked in the prison's shadowy depths. In my desperation for answers, for some hint of understanding, I attempted to speak to the other prisoners. Their haggard faces stared back at me, their eyes reflecting a terror that words could not describe. I soon discovered why their silence was so complete. Many of them had their tongues cut out, a cruel reminder of the prison's unspoken rule of silence. On the third night of my incarceration, a chilling spectacle unfolded. Warden David, flanked by a cohort of guards, led several prisoners and me out into the open area of the prison. The moon cast an eerie glow over the prison yard, the cold light reflecting off David's smiling face. "The table is set," he announced, his voice echoing through the yard. His words hung heavy in the air, a portent of the horror that was about to unfold. Before my disbelieving eyes, a transformation occurred. The guards, the warden, their bodies contorted and shifted, their human forms giving way to monstrous wolf-like creatures. Their growls filled the night, a terrifying symphony of impending doom. I watched, frozen in horror, as the prisoners fell one by one, their screams of terror and pain echoing through the night. The creatures feasted, their monstrous forms bathed in the harsh, cold moonlight. The morning sun brought with it a semblance of normalcy, a cruel contrast to the horrors of the night before. The prison was quiet, the silence a reminder of the night's feast. The remains of the bodies of the fallen prisoners had been removed, and the work was done with a mechanical efficiency that spoke of a worked routine. I watched it all from my office, those stone walls reminding me of duty. In the days that followed, an awe-inspiring silence descended on the prison. The prisoners, those who remained, huddled in their cells, their eyes hunted and their voices quiet. The guards walked the corridors with a look of quiet satisfaction, their icy smiles a reminder of their true nature. "Oh yes, please forgive me. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is David, and I am the warden of St. Margaret's most beautiful prison. In my humble opinion, the punishment system in my prison is the most effective. I would tell you all about it in great detail, but right now, I have a little business to complete." I picked up the phone, dialed the number of the main office. "There's been a riot at the prison," I reported, not taking my eyes off the papers of the recently arrived troubled rookie. "Fortunately, he has been dealt with. But unfortunately, we have casualties. A young guard named Michael was killed during the confrontation." I leaned back in the worn-out leather chair, the polished badge on my chest reflecting the stark fluorescent light of my office. As the warden of the newest prison in the state, the job was a point of pride for me. My name is Jack, and this prison, this concrete giant, was supposed to be my legacy. This prison was my design, my brainchild. State-of-the-art security systems, electronically locked cells that could stand up to the most determined inmates, and surveillance cameras that left no corner unwatched. We even had drone patrols on the perimeter. Every detail was meticulously crafted, every loophole thoroughly examined. It was an impenetrable fortress, a testament to modern technology and architecture. 3 months since we'd opened the doors, 3 months since the first batch of prisoners had stepped onto the cold, pristine tiles, and things had started to shift. It began subtly. Cells would power down for no discernible reason, leaving guards scrambling to manually lock them down. Surveillance feeds would go static, only to return to normal with no evidence of tampering. My IT guys were pulling their hair out, unable to find any bugs in the system. Then, the rumors started among the guards. They spoke in hushed whispers about strange odors permeating the prison, like sulfur and rotting meat. They complained about unsettling noises during the graveyard shift, a chorus of low growls and scuttling sounds that echoed through the empty corridors. I dismissed these as mere figments of overactive imaginations, fueled by the late-night ghost stories some of the older guards liked to share. But then the inmates started talking. Hardened men, criminals who had seen the worst humanity had to offer, began murmuring about something in the dark. They talked about small, shadowy figures that skulked around their cells. Days passed, and the strange occurrences continued. The random system failures, the odd smells, the eerie sounds. The prison felt heavy, like a storm was brewing, an unseen tension hanging in the air. The guards started taking leaves, some even quit without notice. The inmates grew more restless, their sleep plagued by nightmares. The prison, once my monument of order and control, was slowly turning into a house of fear and mystery. The worst part was, I felt powerless, unable to quell the rising tide of panic. In the lunchroom, I overheard more stories from the inmates. Tales of shadowy figures that moved with an inhuman speed, whispers that filled their ears with unspeakable horrors, and the smell of decay that seemed to seep from the walls. One day, on my rounds, I found the cell of one of the most dangerous criminals empty. The bed was neatly made, personal belongings stacked in a corner. There was no note, no explanation. The prisoner had simply disappeared. The prison was quiet that day, the deafening silence drowning out the familiar clanking of metal doors and distant conversations. I retired to my office, an uneasy feeling gnawing at me. Prison, my prison, was no longer a symbol of justice or order. It was now turning into a place of incomprehensible horror. And I, her warden, was forced to wrestle with the fear and uncertainty that hung over her like a shroud. As the day drew to a close, I found myself standing at the edge of the prison yard, staring up at the high concrete walls. They seemed to loom over me, casting long, dark shadows that stretched across the ground like skeletal fingers. Days turned into weeks, each one blending into the next in a monotonous, eerie rhythm. The strange occurrences in the prison became our new normal. The fear, once a disquieting undercurrent, now surged like a tidal wave, enveloping us all in its icy grip. The inmates, men who had once stood tall and defiant, were breaking. I could see it in their eyes, a vacant look that spoke of a terror I couldn't fathom. Some would cower in the corners of their cells, their bodies shaking with an inexplicable fear. Food trays were returned untouched, the inmates' appetites stolen by the dread that permeated the prison. Some took to self-harm, their bodies becoming canvases of their torment. Deep gashes and burn marks littered their skin, a gruesome testament to their desperate attempts to drown out the fear. Suicide attempts became a grim routine, with guards on constant vigil to thwart their desperate attempts at escape. And then, the disappearances started. Guards, especially those on night duty, would vanish without a trace. Their lockers would remain untouched, their uniforms neatly folded. They left behind confused families and an atmosphere of dread that hung over the prison like a death shroud. Days later, they would be found. Some were dead, their bodies showing signs of severe trauma, their faces frozen in an eternal expression of terror. Those who were found alive were no better off. They were catatonic, their eyes vacant, their minds seemingly lost it. The prison was crumbling, not in its physical form, but in its very essence. The fear was not just in the minds of the inmates and guards. It had seeped into the walls, the floors, the air. My nights were restless, filled with nightmares of shadowy figures and disquieting whispers. Sleep, once a refuge, had become a battleground, my dreams a mirror to the horrors unfolding in the prison. One night, as I tossed and turned in my bed, I woke up to a chilling sight. A small, shadowy figure stood by the foot of my bed, its face obscured by the darkness. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and it stared at me, its gaze penetrating the veil of fear and sleep. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, staring, its presence an embodiment of the prison's unseen terror. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving behind an eerie silence that echoed my pounding heart. That encounter marked a turning point. The prison was not just a breeding ground for fear and horror. It was now a portal to the unknown, a bridge between our world and something far more sinister. Days turned into a blur, the fear a constant companion. My once bustling office was now a solitary haven, the steady hum of the surveillance monitors a haunting lullaby. Every flicker of the screen, every static buzz, sent chills down my spine, amplifying the feeling of impending doom. As I surveyed the prison through the grainy footage, I felt a deep sense of despair. The men I was responsible for, both guards and inmates alike, were falling apart. Their hollow eyes, their gaunt faces, their trembling hands, all telling a story of a fear that gnawed at their sanity. I tried to keep up the semblance of order, arranging counseling sessions for the inmates, bringing in psychologists and spiritual leaders, but it was like trying to hold back a tidal wave with a bucket. One night, I found myself in the control room, staring at a wall of monitors displaying the static-filled images of the prison. A sudden movement caught my eye. On one of the screens, I saw a guard making his rounds. It was Thompson, one of the few who hadn't left or disappeared. He was a brave man, a former Marine who held onto his duty like a lifeline amidst the chaos. As I watched him patrol the empty corridor, I noticed something. Small, shadowy figures skulking behind him, their glowing eyes visible even through the grainy footage. I watched in horror as they closed in on him, their forms merging with the shadows. I found myself on my feet, my heart pounding in my chest as I sprinted down the hallway. I arrived at the corridor just in time to see Thompson turn around, his face going white as he stared at the empty space behind him. He collapsed, his body convulsing as he clutched his chest. I ran to him, my mind racing as I called for help over the radio. But I knew it was too late. The life faded from his eyes as he stared past me, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. His final words, a hoarse whisper that chilled me to the bone. "They're here." In the end, it all came down to the fact that the police came to us. They had to find out the cause of a series of unexplained tragedies. The arrival of the police was a mere formality, a nod to the semblance of order in the face of an unknowable terror. They roamed the hollow corridors, their faces masked by a thin veneer of professionalism, barely concealing the undercurrent of dread. The investigations were thorough, a maze of questioning, evidence gathering, and futile attempts to piece together the puzzle. But the prison was an enigma that defied logic, a monument to the inexplicable and the unseen. The remaining guards went about their duties with an air of resignation, their faces mirroring the hopelessness that had become our shared reality. 5 days into the investigation, something changed. As I walked down the all-too-familiar corridor, a sudden chill crept up my spine. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest as I felt a presence, an otherworldly sensation that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Turning around, I was met with a sight that will haunt me till my dying day. There they were, the shadowy figures not confined to the corners of my eye but standing right before me. They were small, like children, their faces twisted into expressions of rage and terror. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. The figures advanced, their forms flickering like a mirage, their whispers growing louder. I turned and ran, the horrifying apparitions hot on my heels. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted down the hallway, my breaths coming in short gasps. Just as I felt my strength waning, I made it to the control room. Slamming the door behind me, I collapsed against it, my body shaking from the adrenaline and fear. I was safe for now. But the reprieve was short-lived. A sudden heat gripped the room, and a bright orange glow illuminated the corridor outside. Flames erupted from the bowels of the prison, consuming everything in its path. The prison was burning. I didn't have a moment to waste. Grabbing the radio, I sounded the alarm, instructing everyone to evacuate immediately. The flames spread quickly, the heat turning the concrete walls into a furnace. The prison was ablaze, the once imposing structure reduced to a fiery skeleton. But we had made it out, a small victory amidst the overwhelming loss. The police cordoned off the area, their faces reflecting the shock and awe of the unfolding spectacle. Despite the best efforts of the investigators, no explanation was found for the series of tragic and mysterious events. The prison was closed, its remnants a grim reminder of the horror that had unfolded within its walls. I could feel the weight of the past as we approached the imposing edifice. The prison, long abandoned, squatted in the twilight like a brooding monolith, its silence only surpassed by the centuries-old secrets it guarded. It was a place where laughter had died, replaced by a mournful symphony of iron bars clashing and cries echoing in the wind. I shivered, not from the cool evening breeze but from a sense of foreboding, a premonition of the strange mysteries that awaited us. "Are you all right, Jake?" Meredith, our group's self-proclaimed spiritual guide, asked, her hazel eyes studying me with an unsettling intensity. "Just thinking about the place," I replied, my voice barely a whisper, my gaze unflinchingly fixed on the prison's austere facade. "It's more than just a building, you know. It's a tomb of stories. Each brick, each stone, is drenched in tales of despair and sorrow," she intoned, her voice lending an eerie cadence to the hush of the evening. Her words hung in the air like an ominous prophecy, making me more aware of the daunting task ahead. We were not just amateur paranormal enthusiasts. We were storytellers, ready to narrate a tale that had been muted by the walls of this prison. Our team was an eclectic mix. Meredith, the spiritual guide, Paul, the tech wizard, and me, Jake, the aspiring writer who believed that every story deserved to be told, no matter how unsettling. Paul was busy fiddling with his equipment, an array of devices designed to sense the slightest hint of paranormal activity. "We're all set," he announced, his voice barely concealing the excitement. As we crossed the threshold, the chilling air wrapped around us like a shroud. The echo of our footsteps seemed to breathe life into the long-forgotten tales of the prison. The decrepit walls, stained with age, wore an eerie silence, as if they were waiting for the right moment to unfold their narrative. Paul, ever the pragmatist, was the first to break the silence. "The electromagnetic readings are off the charts here. Something is definitely up," he stated, his eyes never leaving the device in his hand. Meredith nodded. "I can feel a strong energy presence. There is a heaviness that is overpowering." I could feel it too. A strange pressure that seemed to push against us. A silent resistance from the ghostly inhabitants of the prison. It was as if the air was thick with the untold stories of the past, hanging in the balance between the world of the living and the dead. We decided to explore the cell block first, a long, dim corridor lined with decrepit cells. Each cell held a tale of its own, the rusted iron bars a testament to the lives that had been confined within. The silence was punctuated only by our own soft footsteps and the occasional creak of the prison settling into its nightly slumber. As I stood in front of one cell, an inexplicable sense of dread washed over me. It was as if I could feel the despair of the inmate who had once occupied the space. The worn-out cot, the barren walls, and the small window that offered but a glimpse of the outside world were stark reminders of a life spent in isolation. "I can sense a strong presence here," Meredith said, her voice a hushed whisper as she stood beside me, her eyes closed in concentration. As the words left her mouth, Paul's device began to beep wildly. "Guys, we've got something here," he said, his voice echoing down the corridor. His eyes, wide with anticipation, were glued to the screen of his device. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier, as if time itself was bending under the weight of the untold stories. I felt an unseen presence, a whisper of the past that still lingered within the stone-cold walls. Meredith shivered and pulled her coat tighter around her. "There's a sadness here," she murmured. "A despair that's been imprinted on these walls." I could feel it too, a palpable sorrow that hung heavy in the air. I thought about the countless souls that had been confined within these walls, the stories of their lives etched into the very fabric of the building. The chilling reality of their existence seemed to seep into my bones, filling me with a sense of dread that was as real as the cold stone beneath my feet. Suddenly a faint sound echoed through the corridor. It was a soft, melancholic hum, barely audible yet undeniably present. We froze, our breath hitching in our throats. Paul's device began to beep wildly, the frantic rhythm matching the pounding of my heart. The hum grew louder, filling the corridor with a haunting melody that was as beautiful as it was chilling. It was a song of despair, a lament of lost freedom. The song reverberated around us, its melody weaving a chilling tale of sorrow and despair. We stood there transfixed, as the haunting melody washed over us, touching the deepest corners of our souls. It was as if the prison was finally ready to share its secrets, its walls breaking their centuries-long silence. "Did you hear that?" Paul finally broke the silence, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at us, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. "We heard it," I replied, my voice barely audible. The haunting melody still echoed in my mind, its chilling notes a stark reminder of the dark secrets that the prison held. We moved deeper into the building, the only light coming from Paul's handheld device and the glow of our flashlights dancing on the decaying walls. The eerie song from before hung over us like a specter, our ears straining for any trace of the haunting melody. Yet, the prison remained silent, its narrative suspended in the cold air. As we ventured further into the labyrinth, Meredith's expression turned graver. "The energy is stronger here," she muttered, her hand fluttering over her heart. "It's almost overwhelming." Paul looked at his device, then at Meredith. "The readings corroborate what you're saying," he said, his voice holding an edge of apprehension that I had never heard before. I watched them, my mind teetering between skepticism and belief. The eerie atmosphere, the chilling melody, the inexplicable cold spots. It was hard to dismiss it all as mere coincidence. The prison was seeping into us, its history, its dread, its despair. We found ourselves standing in front of the solitary confinement cells, the most dreaded section of the prison. The air was markedly colder here, the silence more oppressive. The barred doors hung open, revealing the darkness within. Entering the first cell, I felt the space close in around me. The walls seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, the echoes of past suffering reverberating through the air. I imagined a prisoner, trapped within these four walls, his pleas for mercy drowned by the stone-cold silence. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the cell, causing me to shudder. I heard Meredith gasp, and I turned to see her standing at the doorway, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. "Did you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The despair, the agony." I nodded, unable to find my voice. I could feel it too. the remnants of fear and despair etched into the very essence of the cell. Paul, who had been quiet, suddenly let out a low whistle. "Guys, you need to see this," he said, his device pointed at the far wall. A faint outline glowed on the screen, an outline that bore an uncanny resemblance to a human figure. My heart hammered in my chest as I looked from the screen to the empty cell. There was nothing there, yet Paul's device indicated otherwise. We have a presence," Paul stammered, his normally calm demeanor replaced by nervous excitement. Meredith took a step back, her face pale. "I can feel it too," she said, her voice trembling. "It S ... IT S so strong." For a moment we stood in silence, a sense of awe and dread filling the cell. We were not alone. The prison was alive, its inhabitants unseen but undeniably present. The sudden realization sent a chill down my spine. The prison was not just a building, it was a living entity, a container for the souls who had been wronged, their cries for justice echoing through the ages. A faint whisper broke the silence, a chilling reminder of the presence that lurked in the shadows. The whisper grew louder, filling the cell with a melancholic symphony that echoed the despair etched into the prison walls. The further we ventured, the stronger the feelings became. Despair, sorrow, anger, fear. It was as if we were walking through a gallery of human emotions, each cell a canvas painted with the shades of human suffering. Suddenly, Meredith halted, her hand flying to her chest. "Something's not right," she murmured, her eyes darting around nervously. Paul and I exchanged glances. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice echoing in the hollow corridor. She swallowed hard, her face pale. There's something else here," she said, her voice trembling. "Something dark." A chill ran down my spine at her words. The prison was already a hub of despair and suffering. What could possibly be darker than that? Paul's device began to beep wildly, the red lights flashing ominously. "She's right," he said, his voice strained. "The readings are off the charts. There's something else here with us." Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the corridor, the chilling touch sending shivers down my spine. The air seemed to crackle with an unseen energy, a dark presence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We stood there, frozen in our tracks, as the prison echoed with a haunting melody. It was the same song from before, but this time it held a darker tone. It was a lament, a plea for mercy from the depths of despair. As the song faded, we were left standing in the oppressive silence, the echo of the haunting melody hanging in the air. "We need to tread carefully," Meredith said, her voice barely a whisper. "There's more to this place than we imagined." I nodded, my mind racing with the horrifying possibilities. We descended further into the heart of the prison, the darkness swallowing us whole. The air was thicker here, laden with a despair so palpable that it was almost suffocating. The walls, drenched in centuries-old secrets, seemed to breathe along with us, their cold stone surfaces pulsing with an unseen energy. Meredith was visibly shaken, her usual calm demeanor replaced by a nervous tension that made her movements jerky. Paul, on the other hand, was a picture of concentration, his gaze fixed on his device, his fingers dancing over the buttons as he attempted to decipher the unseen presence around us. The eerie silence was broken by the occasional beep from Paul's device, each one a chilling reminder of the invisible inhabitants of the prison. As we moved further into the labyrinth, the beeps grew more frequent, the unseen presence growing stronger. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the corridor, causing us to jump in alarm. It sounded like a door slamming shut, its echo reverberating through the stone walls. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Paul nodded, his face pale. "It came from that direction," he said, pointing towards a dimly lit corridor. With bated breath, we made our way towards the sound. The corridor led us to a large iron door. It was closed, its cold, rusty surface emanating an aura of dread. "This is it," Meredith murmured, her voice trembling. "This is where the dark energy is strongest." Paul's device was beeping wildly, the red lights flashing ominously. "She's right," he said, his voice strained. "There's definitely something in there." With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. A chill ran down my spine as we stepped into the room. It was a large, open space, the air heavy with the scent of decay. The room was unlike any other we had encountered so far. The walls were lined with chains, their rusty surfaces a stark reminder of the torture that had taken place within these four walls. A large wooden table stood in the middle of the room, its surface stained with dried blood. The room was a living nightmare, a testament to the horrors that had been inflicted upon the prisoners. The chains rattled softly, the eerie sound echoing through the room. It was as if the room was reliving its past, its walls whispering the tales of horror and suffering. I can't stay here," Meredith murmured, her face pale. "The energy IT too much." I nodded, my own heart hammering in my chest. The room was a vortex of negative energy, its aura of dread almost suffocating. As we turned to leave, a soft whisper echoed through the room. It was a plea, a cry for mercy from the depths of despair. The whisper grew louder, filling the room with a chilling symphony of pain and suffering. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, the chilling touch sending shivers down my spine. "We're not alone," Paul whispered, his voice barely audible. I could feel it too, the unseen presence lurking in the shadows. The room was alive, its inhabitants unseen but undeniably present. The walls seemed to close in around us, their cold stone surfaces pulsing with the heartbeats of the souls trapped within. Let's get out of here," Meredith stuttered, her voice trembling. Paul, despite his fascination with the supernatural, was quick to agree. His device, still beeping wildly, was a stark reminder of the unseen presence around us. The door, however, refused to budge. No matter how hard we pushed, it stood firm, as if held shut by some unseen force. Panic started to seep in, a cold, clawing fear that gripped our hearts. We were trapped, locked within the room that was a living testament to the horrors of the past. The walls seemed to close in around us, their cold stone surfaces pulsing with an unseen energy. Then, as suddenly as it had slammed shut, the door swung open. We stumbled out, our hearts pounding, the taste of fear fresh on our tongues. The corridor outside was a welcome relief, its air free of the oppressive dread that had filled the room. As we caught our breaths, I couldn't help but look back at the room. It was a portal into the past, a mirror reflecting the horrors that had taken place within the prison walls. The room had shared its secrets, its walls breaking their centuries-long silence to reveal the tales of horror and suffering. That night, as we huddled together in the relative safety of the prison's entrance hall, I couldn't shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me. The prison was a living entity, its walls whispering the tales of horror and despair. It was a tomb of stories, each one darker than the last.